G'day, my name's Marty Kendall. I'm thrilled to be here to discuss where is nutrition headed. Unlike many of the other speakers this weekend you've heard, as Brian mentioned, I'm not a doctor, I'm an engineer. So I love to deal in numbers, data and charts, as you'll see. So first I want to tackle the topic of where is nutrition headed, first by looking back at the past to see the long-term trends that give us some interesting clues of where we're headed. Then I want to dive into the fascinating topic of satiety by looking at the analysis of 140,000 days of data from 40,000 people to understand how the macronutrients and the micronutrients affect how much we eat. But first, some disclosures. As I mentioned, I'm not a doctor or a nutritionist, I'm an engineer, but I do run some classes. A macros masterclass that guides people to dial in their protein, carbs and fat, as well as a micros masterclass that shows people how to get the nutrients they need from the food they eat. We've also got a data-driven fasting challenge that guides people to use their glucose as a fuel gauge to understand when and what to eat. And I'm really grateful to Jeff and the conference for flying me here today from Australia to talk to you. It's a real honor, thank you very much. So my big question today for you is, what if nutrition was about nutrients? Rather than avoiding cholesterol, saturated fat, salt, carbohydrates, animal-based foods, plant-based foods, everything out there is trying to kill us according to somebody. It's crazy. It's really confusing knowing what to eat. But what if putting nutrients at the center of what we eat could help us navigate the complex nutritional landscape to cut through the noise? To give you a feel for where we're going, this chart shows 3 different ways of looking at nutrition and quantifying the food we eat. The x-axis across the bottom shows nutrient density per calorie. Foods like spinach, watercress, asparagus, kale, etc. give us a lot of nutrient bang for our calorie buck. These foods give us those harder to find micronutrients, but at the same time, we can't eat a lot of them. Imagine you tried to live on watercress for a day. How much watercress could you eat before you literally explode? And then you're fanging for the donut in the bottom left corner later in the day because you're just so hungry because you can't get enough protein and energy from those non-starchy green veggies. But fortunately, we can think in terms of nutrient density per serving. So as you move to the top, you see foods like liver, seafood, beef, eggs. These foods provide the protein, enough energy, and a ton of actual nutrients to form the foundation of our diet. So we can sort of forage towards the top to get the protein and energy, and then later on, if we need those extra micronutrients, we can look at the non-starchy green veggies towards the right. Across the chart, you can see that different foods are shaded from green. They're the highest satiety foods based on our satiety index score, which I'll be talking to you about today. Meanwhile, the foods shown in red in the bottom left corner, like the donut, are really easy to overeat. These are the foods that are sort of our danger, kryptonite foods that we just can't stop eating once we start. So this being a low-carb conference, many of you will have seen charts like this that show a really interesting correlation between our carbohydrate intake and obesity, particularly between 1960 and 2000. I initially got into this journey, as Brian mentioned, because my wife Monica has type 1 diabetes. About 11 years ago, we found the work of Dr. Richard Bernstein and the type 1 group community. Monica reduced the carbohydrates, her insulin dose basically halved, blood sugars improved, HbA1c improved, quality of life improved. As you can see, we lost a bit of weight. We were definitely massive low-carb advocates and really passionate about it. And then when keto came along a few years later, we were definitely early adopters. But fascinatingly, when you look back at the long-term past, you see that carbs have really just risen to the amount they were maybe 100 years ago when we have the USDA data started being recorded. Carbs have dropped, the second agricultural revolution came along, carbs rose back up. But then in about 1999, artificial sweeteners come along. Food manufacturers no longer need high fructose corn syrup to sweeten everything. Carbs drop, but the obesity epidemic continues to rise. So what gives? What else is providing energy in our food system? Well, here's the graph of fat. You can see over the last 100 years, the fat in our food system has increased by 800 calories per person per day, which is massive. Bill Schindler talked about 3.5 million years ago, we started to create technologies to extract more energy from the food we eat. We created stone tools and fire that enabled us to get more energy from our food. But 100 years ago, some really interesting changes happened. I think two major ones. In 1910, Procter & Gamble patented the process of creating hydrogenated vegetable oils from industrial seed products. And then in 1914, two very smart scientists, Haber and Bosch, perfected the process of taking nitrogen from the air with natural gas from under the ground to create synthetic fertilizers. After World War II, that combination of injected energy into our food system just created a whole lot more energy. When you look at synthetic fertilizers, they've rocketed up in the last 50 years. We've gone from 33 million tons to 209 million tons. 80% of the natural gas extracted from under the ground is injected into fertilizers, with only 20% going to heating and power. So a massive amount of energy is basically being fed into our food system to create more energy, to create more people that are also bigger. But when we look at the different types of fats, we see that saturated fat that we've been admonished to avoid has only increased marginally by 100 calories per person per day. Meanwhile, it's the mono and polyunsaturated fat that have both increased by about 300 calories per person per day. But what gives? Is this like the Mediterranean dieters adding a bit of extra virgin olive oil to their big ass salads? No. You can see the bottom line doesn't align for olive oil, which has hardly changed over the last 50 years. Meanwhile, it's palm, soybean, sunflower, rapeseed, these industrial seed oils that have just been added more and more and more to our ultra-processed food system to create more energy, combined with sugar and refined grains, along with fortification, colours and flavourings to make these foods look like they contain nutrients, but they don't. When we look at all the macronutrients together, you can see carbs have come up over the last 50 years, fat has been on a steady increase, but that red line, protein, has just bumped up a little bit. When we look at protein in percentage terms, protein's decreased since the 1977 dietary guidelines, while obesity's continued to rise. Carbs maybe would have been available in summer in the past, fat might have been available from fatty animals in the past, but as we've industrialized our food system, it's drifted towards a combination of carbs and fat together, and as that's come together, obesity's continued to rise. So what we see here is we've got, in summer we might have had carbohydrate, which gives us a dopamine hit to say, well done, get some more energy. Similarly, in winter we might have had fat, which tells our body, yeah, we get a dopamine hit, get more of that, we need that to survive. But when they're combined, Professor Dana Small talks about the super additive dopamine response. These foods make us feel effectively addicted to that hyperpalatable, ultra-processed food. So we just can't stop eating them. It feels like glucose fuel tank, our fat fuel tank, and we just eat more of these foods, and eventually they effectively break our metabolism. So where is nutrition headed? Well, based on the long-term trend, is this going to change? Perhaps not. I think potentially we're headed for a dystopian future. We're all addicted, like WALL-E. I love this movie. It's quite prophetic, I think. But we're all addicted to our phone, the dopamine hit. We want instant gratification from everything, including our food. We want our food to be entertaining. We want it to have, dopamine overstimulation. We want it to be entertaining, tasty, cheap, and hyperpalatable. And potentially, for a lot of people, the only option is going to be ultra high-priced GLP-1 antagonists to manage the obesity epidemic, which is probably going to break our, not just our economy at the same time, but fortunately, we can produce GLP-1 in our body in response to nutrient-dense, high-satiety foods. So given this prelude, the big question that's been plaguing me over the last 5 years or so as an engineer, I know it's a bit weird, but what are the most statistically significant parameters of our food that align with eating less versus eating more? The hypothesis that I'm going to present is that organisms balance nutrients versus energy. In an environment with less protein and nutrients, we tend to eat more to get the nutrients we need. But in an environment of a higher protein percentage and more nutrients, we tend to eat less. And really the goal here is to reverse engineer the obesity epidemic and overeating by making better food choices that align with greater satiety and allow us to achieve the desired results. Given the importance of the topic of satiety, not a lot of research has been done into it. Perhaps the most useful and interesting study was back from 1995 at the University of Sydney. They took 38 different popular foods, gave them to research participants, and measured the hunger and satiety every 15 minutes for 3 hours. And at the end of 3 hours, they gave them a banquet and measured how much they ate. Based on that, they developed a satiety index. And fascinatingly, potato, cooked and cooled potato, no sugar, no oil, was the most satiating. But at the same time, we also know that maybe after 3 or 4 hours, a lot of people who are, especially who are insulin resistant, get a blood sugar crash. So we know that maybe 4 or 5 hours later, you're going to be starving hungry because your blood sugar's dropped through the floor. So, not recommending necessarily you go out and eat nothing but potatoes. Some people do, but not recommended. But then at the bottom we see croissant, cake, donut. Those carb and fat combo foods are definitely easy to overeat. At the top we see red meat, white fish. Those high protein foods have some level of satiety, but really 38 data points. It's quite confusing, hard to apply to anything we're going to decide to eat tomorrow. If only we had more data. Well, 5 years ago, Alex Zotov, who's sitting in the front row here, created Nutrient Optimizer that we use in our classes to guide people to dial in their macronutrients and micronutrients. We've now amassed 136,000 days of data from 40,000 people to understand the different parameters of how we eat, both in terms of macronutrients and micronutrients. We don't just have 3 hours, we've got the whole day for multiple weeks, for multiple months, and some people have been with us for years. So we can see, regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of what you're eating, how the macros and micros align with eating less versus eating more. And I'm going to share the analysis with you. This is perhaps the most interesting chart, fascinating. To create this, I divided the data into 10 different bins based on the carbohydrate intake, and then took the average of each of those bins. You can see that in the middle, again, you've got that 43% carbohydrate with the rest of the energy coming from fat. Is really easy to overeat. The maximum calorie intake aligns with that perfect hyperpalatable combo of fat and carbs together. Unfortunately, the average Australian, the average American is just at this point. We've optimized our food system. We've evolved, Bill, to a point where we've made our food system ultra palatable, ultra profitable, and we tend to eat more. But the good news is once we move to the left to a lower carbohydrate diet, between 10 and 20% non-fiber carbohydrate, our calorie intake drops by a massive 25%. So this is sort of the magic of the low carbohydrate diet. We move away from that fat and carb hyperpalatable danger zone to lower carbohydrate foods that are more satiating and typically higher protein. But interestingly, to the far right, a very high carb, very low fat diet is also hard to overeat. Imagine if you had nothing but rice or potatoes or whatever. Those foods are also hard to overeat. It's the combo of fat and carbs together. This chart's probably going to be the least popular, unfortunately, for my presentation. It just basically shows that as we get a higher percentage of fat in our diet, we tend to eat more. So for people who require a therapeutic ketogenic diet for epilepsy, dementia, Parkinson's, major depression, as people have talked about this weekend, can definitely be beneficial to help those sort of conditions. But if you want to improve your body composition, then dialing back the fat in your diet can definitely help dial back the fat on your body. But we can't swing to a very, very low fat diet because protein typically comes with fat, so we need some fat. So we need to find that balance. Andreas talked earlier about the power of protein, and we definitely see that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. As we increase the protein percentage, we just eat less in a fairly linear fashion. People in our data set who ate the most protein, or at least highest protein percentage, tended to eat 58% fewer calories, which is a massive drop. Again, you see the donut at 8%, average population in America is 16%, Australia is 18%, and as we get more protein and less energy in our diet, we move to the bacon and eggs and then the lean steak. We get a higher satiety diet. Everybody wants to jump from zero to hero overnight and get overnight results, but what we find is best is to just continually level up your diet. Maybe you started at 15% protein, you can try 20% protein. If you need to, you can go to 25. Most people don't need to go past 30 or 40% to get sustainable results in terms of weight loss. It's not just a matter of eating more protein, although you do eat a little bit more protein. That's the red line on the bottom. The emphasis needs to be on dialing back the energy from fat and carbs while prioritizing protein. You can see you get a little bit more protein, but most of the deficit comes from dialing back the energy from fat or carbs together. This work fascinatingly aligns with Rabenheimer and Simpson's work in protein leverage. They basically have demonstrated, whether it be yeast, slime, insects or humans, that we all eat until we get enough protein. You can see the compilation here of data from 48 different human trials. Again, we see the same trend. A higher percentage of protein aligns with eating a lot less energy, although a little bit increasing in protein in absolute terms. But what if it's not just protein leverage, but nutrient leverage? Do we crave other nutrients other than protein? Well, I had the data to find out. Being a curious engineer, as we are, I kept diving into the data to understand how the different micronutrients affect our satiety and how much we eat. We can see here that calcium, as we get more calcium per calorie, we tend to eat less. On the right, you can see as we introduced more chemical fertilizer to our industrialized food system, calcium in our food system declines. So we need to now eat 38% extra energy to get the same amount of calcium as we did in the 1940s. Rabenheimer and Simpson also talk about different specific appetites. They say we crave protein, carbs, fat, and 2 micronutrients at least, sodium and calcium, and we definitely see that in this data. But when I dug a bit deeper, you see potassium is a really dominant nutrient. We don't seem to have a conscious taste for potassium like we do for salt, but it just comes up again and again as a dominant nutrient that we seem to crave. And when we get more potassium per calorie, we consume less energy. You can see again, since the introduction of chemical fertilizers to our food system, we're just getting less potassium. Today it seems that only 2% of Americans are meeting the minimum dietary recommended intake for potassium. And people like Paul Jaminet talk about, in the past, everything we had to eat was full of potassium, and sodium was hard to get. So we probably evolved an appetite for sodium, but today everything's got added sodium in it, so we crave more of it, we eat more of it, but potassium is hard to find, so we need to turn the tables. When you look at all the minerals together, we see that all the minerals will have a similar sort of satiety response, but the longer lines you see are the sodium, potassium, calcium that seem to be the dominant nutrients in our satiety response. Even the vitamins have a satiety response where we get more vitamins per calorie, we eat less, but it's a smaller response than for the minerals. So this brings me to the belief-based section of the presentation. Belinda Fettke's done some amazing work recently, you may have seen, looking at the influence of the Seventh Adventist Church on our current dietary guidelines. You may not be aware, but the Seventh Adventist Church grew out of the temperance movement of the 1800s, and temperance is all about the habitual moderation of natural appetite or passion. And Ellen White was really passionate, ironically, about avoiding passion, particularly sexual passion, and even created a diet. I know it sounds ridiculous in a world today where everybody's getting on TRT and HRT, but to try to mitigate sexual desire. And then Kellogg, as you're probably aware, came along and instigated Kellogg's cornflakes and a whole lot of popular cereals. His protege, Lena Francis Cooper, went on to start the American Dietetic Association in 1917, which is now the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the largest organization of food and nutritional professionals in the world. Today, it seems everybody knows that we should avoid saturated fat, salt, cholesterol, and animal-based foods. But what if instead of avoiding the bad things in food, we just said, let's give our body what it needs, what it craves, what we see in the data, that we're actually craving to get in our food. When you look at sodium, again, you see we seem to crave sodium. We definitely have a conscious appetite for sodium. Sodium's declined in our food system. But amazingly, this one stood out to me, that cholesterol, foods that contain more cholesterol naturally, like liver, eggs, the foods we're told to avoid, actually provide greater satiety. Cholesterol in our food system started declining since the 1950s, again when our food system became more industrialized, injected with extra energy from synthetic fertilizers. As Nina mentioned yesterday, dietary cholesterol was removed from the 2015 dietary guidelines for America after it was shown conclusively that there's no relationship between dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. In spite of this, it's still a core part of many food recommendation systems like Food Compass. Food Compass says it negatively weights cholesterol, saturated fat, and prioritizes unsaturated fats, as you saw before, which have increased massively in our food system. The little brown square shows the weighting for protein and fiber together, which have been given a half weighting, and therefore you get these ridiculous recommendations that are mainly, again, industrialized cereals with labels and pretty things on the packet and cartoons and things that are logically more satiating and healthier, according to many, are ranked down the bottom. So how do we solve this? How do we use a data-driven approach to make sense of what we should be eating? When I talked to Professors Robbenheimer and Simpson about a year ago on my podcast, they suggested I run a multivariate analysis on the data to understand which variables are the most statistically significant and which are noise. So I did. So here's the results. So if you just look at the macronutrients in our diet, protein, carbs, fat, and fiber, we see that moving from a low protein percentage to a higher protein percentage aligns with a 35% reduction in calories. Fiber kicks in with 8% if you eat a more fibrous, minimally processed diet. We tend to eat less energy, but protein is definitely the biggest lever. When we look at all the macronutrients and micronutrients and cholesterol, I was amazed to see cholesterol actually is second to protein. It seems we have perhaps an innate craving for cholesterol in food, and we eat 12% less calories when we eat foods like liver and eggs that contain more cholesterol. And protein drops from 35% to 21%. So perhaps rather than a protein leverage effect, we actually have, some of that effect is could be apportioned to cholesterol. But then we see potassium, sodium, and calcium also coming in with fairly large impacts. But I'm not sure, talking to Andreas, the world is going to be ready for a system that prioritizes cholesterol as a positive ranking factor quite yet. So I dropped it, and then we have protein, potassium, fiber, sodium, calcium, and then some of the vitamins kick in. So protein, the bottom line is protein is the most satiating macronutrient, but once you've got adequate protein in your diet, then you can start chasing foods that contain more potassium, fiber, sodium, calcium, and all the nutrients that your body needs and craves. So where does this all take us? Well, we can use the regression coefficients from the multivariate analysis to actually estimate how many calories we would eat if, say, you were locked in a room with nothing but donuts for a week, or salmon, or liver, or watercress. How many calories would you eat of that? We can actually estimate it using this data to develop a satiety index score to rank food from 0 to 100. Where does that take us? Well, this chart shows 1,000 recipes that I've analysed in terms of diet quality score or nutrient density, protein percentage, and again, the satiety index score is the colouring. So you can see there's a nice alignment between foods that contain nutrients, protein, and satiety. When you look at what that looks like in terms of recipes, you see lean seafood is really hard to overeat with a bit of non-starchy veggies that'll give you the other minerals you need. Then you've got steak and eggs, liver and eggs, it's bacon and spinach and egg. And then you keep moving down to the bottom left corner to see lower protein, more energy dense, even dessert foods recipes in the bottom left. So I think this makes a fair bit of sense, definitely more than Food Compass, and hopefully it'll help a lot of people. So in summary, thank you for your time. I think energy from both carbs and fat is on the rise and unlikely to continue. But luckily, we do know that a higher protein percentage leads to greater satiety. Getting more of all the nutrients in our food aligns with eating less, but particularly fiber, potassium, calcium, and sodium are statistically significant. And we can use this understanding to reverse engineer overeating to optimize for satiety and nutrient density to reach our goals. Thank you.